A very good morning to you all. Thank you very much for coming to this very important panel discussion despite being holiday today. I know it's tough to travel on a holiday. So thank you very much, many of you being here. And also I see many journalists also here. Thank you very much. Today, a panel discussion here at the India International Center organized by Tibet Policy Institute. The title of the conference, as you can see here, China's New Ethnic Law, a legal assault on the survival of Tibetan language, culture, and identity. As many of you already know, that on 1st July 2026, the People's Republic of China will bring into force the so-called Law on Promoting Ethnic Unity and Progress, presented by Beijing as a measure to strengthen national cohesion, social harmony, and modernization. The law appears benign on the surface, yet beneath the language of unity lies one of the most far-reaching legal instruments ever enacted to institutionalize the assimilation and formal sinicization of non-Chinese people under China's colonial occupation. For Tibetans and other nationalities under Chinese occupation, this legislation is not a law promoting ethnic unity. It is the legal codification of a decade-long campaign aimed at transforming Tibetan identity, weakening the Tibetan language, restricting Tibetan Buddhism, and replacing a distinct civilization with a state-defined conception of national identity. What China has pursued for decades through political campaigns, administrative directives, educational reforms, religious restrictions, demographic policies, and surveillance system is now being formalized and protected by national law. The vocabulary has changed from stability, development, and poverty elevation to ethnic unity. But the objective remains the same. That is, a colonial policy for the gradual assimilation of Tibetans into the Chinese nation state. To discuss on this very important issue, we have 5 very prominent expert speakers here. We have Honorable Sikyong Penpa Tsering, the political elected leader of Tibetan people and the president of Central Tibet Administration. We have Major General Jayadeva Bakshi, distinguished military veteran. We have Jayadeva Ranade, president of Center for China Analysis and Strategy here in Delhi. We have Dr. Tenzin, Desal, senior fellow at Tibet Policy Institute. We have Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, professor of Chinese Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. It is my distinct honor to invite Honorable Sikyong Penpa Tsering, the democratically elected political leader of the Tibetan people and the president of the Central Tibet Administration. Since assuming office in 2021 and being elected again in 2026, Sikyong Penpa Tsering has led the Tibetan movement with vision and determination, strengthening international advocacy, engaging governments and policymakers worldwide, and advancing efforts to preserve Tibet's unique cultural, linguistic, and religious heritage. A former speaker of the Tibet Parliament in exile and a respected statesman, he has been at the forefront of addressing Tibet's historic independence and the contemporary Chinese challenges facing Tibet under Chinese occupation. Please join me in welcoming Honorable Sikyong Penpa Tsering for his opening remark. Gongla.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Samlala, for organizing this, and the Tibet Policy Institute for organizing this event here in Delhi. The issue that we are talking about today has a lot of ramifications and consequence for Tibet, Tibetan people. Needless to, maybe at the outset, I want to mention that Tibet has always been a nation with a civilization of its own. The Tibetans have lived on this highest and the largest plateau on earth for millennia, and Tibet has never ever been directly ruled by any country, including China. That said, as Mr. Zamla mentioned, that within days, on 1st July 2026, the People's Republic of China will bring into force its so-called ethnic unity law, adopted by its rubber-stamp parliament, the National People's Congress, on 12 March 2026. At first glance, as Ms. Amla said, the legislation appears benign. The communist autocrats, authoritarian regimes always have very nice names with very bad intentions. It speaks of unity, speaks of harmony, speaks of national cohesion and the forging of a shared identity. These are words that in almost any society evoke positive aspirations. Yet, history reminds us that some of the gravest injustices have been committed in the language of peace, order, and unity. This law, the so-called Ethnic Unity and Progress Law, is one such example. To the outside world, it's presented as a framework for strengthening ethnic solidarity. To Tibetans, however, it represents something fundamentally different. It represents the legal codification of the decades-long campaign aimed at transforming Tibetan identity, weakening Tibetan culture, restricting religious life, and replacing a distinct civilization with a state-defined conception of national identity. In essence, this tantamount to China committing crimes against humanity and legalizing genocide in Tibet. When reports of this legislation first emerged late last year, many observers assumed it represented a significant shift in China's ethnic policy. My colleagues and I carefully studied every provision after it was formally adopted. We quickly realized something deeply troubling. There is very little in this law that is genuinely new. Nearly every assimilatory measure contained in the legislation has already been implemented in Tibet over many years through party directives, administrative regulations, educational reforms, religious restrictions, surveillance systems, and security campaigns. The significance of this legislation, therefore, lies not in introducing new policies, but in providing an existing system with the force and permanence of law. That distinction is critically important. Policies may change, campaigns may come and go, administrative directives may be revised, but when governments transform political objectives into legislation, they seek to normalize them. They seek to institutionalize them and shield them from criticism. The law gives the appearance of legitimacy to policies that would otherwise be recognized for what they are. China is not creating a new system in Tibet. It's giving an old system a legal mask. What has existed for decades under the language of stability, maintenance, development, and poverty elevation is now formally presented as ethnic unity. The vocabulary has changed. The objective has not. Soon after the law was adopted, the 16th Kashak presented a resolution during the budget session of the Tibetan Parliament in exile in March this year in Dharamsala, and the resolution was adopted unanimously. We not only oppose but reject this legislation as fundamentally illegitimate. In a 7-point resolution, we condemned it as an instrument of forced assimilation whose ultimate objective is gradual erosion of Tibetan language, religion, culture, and identity. We further affirmed that the legislation not only contradicts internationally recognized human rights standards, but also undermines principles contained within China's own constitution and its laws concerning regional ethnic autonomy. This legislation serves two principal purposes. First, it provides the Chinese government with an explicit legal framework to intensify long-standing assimilation policies on Tibetan, Uyghurs, and Mongolian people within PRC. That also includes other peoples. At the center of this legislation lies the directive to forge a strong sense of community for the Chinese nation, the Zhonghua Minzu. While this may sound inclusive, its practical implication is profoundly different. It requires people with their own languages, histories, cultures, and identities to gradually subordinate those identities to a singular state-defined national identity. Unity in this formulation does not celebrate diversity. It seeks to replace diversity. Second, the legislation attempts to insulate these policies from both domestic and international criticism. Once assimilation is codified into law, criticism can be portrayed as opposition to the rule of law itself. Beijing increasingly seeks to argue that concerns raised by governments, scholars, journalists, or international organizations constitute interference in China's internal affairs rather than legitimate responses to internationally recognized human rights obligations. This represents a significant shift in China's governance strategy. Over the past 7 decades, China's approach towards Tibet has passed through several distinct phases. It began with military incorporation, followed by the so-called socialist transformation, collectivization, political campaigns, and cultural revolution. Later came economic development, patriotic education campaigns, secularization following the 2008 protests, and more recently, intensified policies of Sinicization. The ethnic unity law represents the latest phase of this evolution. What were once political campaigns have now become statutory obligations. This is why the law deserves international attention. To understand why this legislation is so consequential, we must also understand Tibet itself. Tibet is not simply an administrative region on a political map. It is one of the world's most oldest civilizations. It possesses a recorded history stretching back well over a millennia and archaeological evidence indicating human settlement on the Tibetan plateau thousands of years earlier. During the 7th century, under the leadership of Songtsen Gampo, the Yalung dynasty unified the Tibetan plateau into a powerful empire. Over the following centuries, Tibet maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring powers, concluded treaties, and developed its own political institutions, legal traditions, military organization, and administrative systems. The Tibetan script, created during this formative period, became the foundation of one of Asia's richest literary traditions. We all know where the Tibetan script came from. It came from the Gupta Brahmi script of India. Monastic universities flourished as centers of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, art, and scholarship. Buddhism, introduced from India, profoundly transformed Tibetan civilization, shaping values centered upon compassion, nonviolence, and intellectual inquiry. These developments were not peripheral chapters in world's history. They gave rise to a civilization with its own language, institutions, religious traditions, historical memory, and cultural continuity. History matters because identity is rooted in historical experience. It's precisely because Tibet possesses such a deep and continuous civilizational identity that attempts at forced assimilation encounter enduring resistance by the Tibetans. No legislation can erase centuries of collective memory. No administrative directive can replace a people's language. No political campaign can extinguish a civilization that has survived for generations. To the international community, this law presents a distinct challenge. Over the past decade, China has sought to reshape the international order by expanding its influence within multilateral institutions and steering them towards norms that favor authoritarian governance. Since I'm speaking to you in Delhi, I must point out that this law extends its jurisdiction globally and outside the PRC. Article 63 points out towards this fact, the extra jurisdictional element where people sitting on the dais here, including our friends Jayadeva, Ranade ji, Bakshi ji, and Kondapalli ji, could also be arrested in future if that is taken as a law by the Interpol. Now, therefore, this law targets anyone criticizing China's authoritarian regime and its assimilist policies. International human rights law recognizes that every people has the right to preserve its language, practice its religion, enjoy its culture, and transmit these traditions to future generations. Yet, China's long-standing policies in Tibet, now reinforced through the new ethnic unity law, stand in contravention of the very international human rights instruments to which China is a signatory. Even more striking is the fact that this legislation contradicts the People's Republic of China's own constitutional framework. We talk about the 1949, 1954 Common Minimum Program, 1982 Constitution, and the 1984 Law on National Regional Autonomy. Likewise, the law on regional national autonomy affirms the rights of minority nationalities to preserve and develop their own languages, cultures, customs, and distinct way of life. But then again, China never implemented those laws, even if it is there. That is why China has a law like the elephant's tusk to show to the world, and a law that they implement, which is very different from the Constitution of China. If you look at the Constitution of China, everybody would say it is very nice constitutional framework, but when it comes to implementation, it's totally different thing. So the new ethnic law undermines these commitments by placing political conformity above cultural diversity and prioritizing assimilation over genuine autonomy. We are all familiar with the history of the 17-point agreement. The Tibetan people have consistently maintained that this agreement was signed under military coercion and therefore lacks genuine legal and political legitimacy. However, even if one were to accept the agreement at face value, this new ethnic law, unitic law, fundamentally contradicts the very promises contained within it. The agreement explicitly pledged that Tibet's existing political system, religious institutions, and way of life would remain unchanged, and that the central authorities would not impose reforms by compulsion. The present legislation moves in precisely the opposite direction by institutionalizing policies that seek to reshape Tibetan identity, language, religion, and culture under a single state-defined national identity. Tibet remains one of the world's longest unresolved political conflicts. The conflict did not begin with debates over development or modernization. It began in the 1950s when the People's Liberation Army entered Tibet, and the political future of the Tibetan nation was fundamentally altered. Since that time, generations of Tibetans have continued to resist policies threatening Tibetan distinct identity, culture, and religion. The loss of Tibet's sovereignty transformed the geopolitical landscape of Asia. Independent states across South Asia, which had historically bordered Tibet, suddenly found themselves sharing long and sensitive frontiers with People's Republic of China. The implications continue to shape regional security, diplomacy, and strategic stability to this day. For these reasons, Tibet is not merely a domestic issue within China. It's a question of international concern, one that touches upon human rights, international law, regional peace, environmental security, and the universal principle that every people has the right to preserve its history, identity, and cultural heritage. At the heart of the central administration's vision for resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict lies the middle way approach, a peaceful, pragmatic, and mutually beneficial framework proposed by His Holiness the Great 14th Dalai Lama. It does not seek separation from the People's Republic of China, but genuine autonomy within the framework of the Chinese Constitution, enabling Tibetans to preserve their language, religion, and culture, and way of life, while becoming, in the words of the proposal, masters of its own affairs. For more than 4 decades, His Holiness has consistently demonstrated his commitment to dialogue and reconciliation, believing that lasting peace can only be achieved through mutual respect rather than coercion. Unfortunately, the recently enacted ethnic unity law takes China in precisely the opposite direction. Rather than creating conditions for trust and reconciliation, it institutionalized policies of assimilation under the guise of national unity. It replaces dialogue with compulsion and diversity with conformity. Such an approach cannot produce lasting stability, because peace built on fear is never durable, and unity achieved by erasing a people's language, religion, and culture is neither genuine nor just. The choice before China is therefore clear. It can continue down the path of coercion, deepening mistrust and prolonging one of the world's oldest unresolved conflicts, or it can embrace the path of dialogue, reconciliation, and mutual respect offered by the middle way policy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration. Now, on this issue, we will be working internationally with governments on or before the 1st of July. We will be reaching out to as many governments as possible to create awareness on the law that China has adopted. I have already mentioned about the global initiatives that China has been undertaking, including global governance, that China's tentacles of governance are already spreading, and there is already an element of transnational jurisdiction in this law, which can even prosecute people who speak against this law in any other parts of the world. So I think it's high time that the international community pays attention to what China is doing, not what China is saying. China is talking about dialogue, negotiation internationally, but what they are doing inside Tibet or in China to the Tibetans or with the Uyghurs or the Mongolians or the Hong Kongers or the Taiwanese is not dialogue. It's always about coercion. And China's hegemonic ambitions have been proven after their attack on Tibet, and its hegemonic ambitions and belligerence in the region continues. So I think we all need to rise up, ultimately, whether we realize it or not, or we recognize it or not. It is a fight between autocrats and democrats. So in China today, I call China today is an autocratic capitalist under the garb of communism. So we all have to fight this together. We cannot do it alone. That is why we have this conference today, and we have many experts on China and Tibet, Professor Kondapalli, General Bakshi ji, Jayadeva, Ranade, they have been studying China for a very long time, and I think it'll be interesting to hear their understanding of what this ethnic unity law means for Tibet and Tibetan people, and also its consequences on India. Because I've been saying at one time, authorities were saying China is recruiting Tibetans in the PLA. But I told our friends here that how much do you think the Chinese government can trust Tibetans with guns on the Indo-Tibetan border? So there will be many elements, because the older generations of Tibetans have a lot of respect for India, because India, we call India the land of our Guru. So, but that respect might vanish if the new generations of Tibetans' whole mentality and psychology is changed towards the Chinese and lose memory of our relation with India. So that will also have its security implications for India in the long term because of this ethnic unity law. Thank you so very much for your presence here, and also sharing, who will be sharing your concerns on this ethnic unity law. And thank you also for your presence. I hope the Indian media will pick up this story, because it's not just a simple story. It has a lot of significance for every one of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for the very detailed and very powerful speech. As you have rightly said, the global community must pay attention to this, on what not what China is saying, but what China intend to do. Thank you very much, sir. We also would like to request some of you seated here to move this side so that the speakers could see you right in front of us, because this dice covers your face. So it would be nice if some of you could move over here. We have a lot of space here, please. We also have a question answer with the journalist right after the panel discussion. So I request the journalists to stay for another half an hour or so. Now we have the panelists. I request each panelist to give speech of about 15 to 20 minutes, so that we have more time for the Q&A with the journalists and also other interested individuals present here. The first speaker among the panelists, Major General Bakshi ji. Major General Bakshi ji is one of India's most distinguished military veterans, strategic thinker, and security analyst. During his distinguished career in the Indian Army, he had held many important command and staff appointments and was decorated for his outstanding service. Following his retirement, he has become a prominent voice on national security, geopolitical affairs, strategic studies. A prolific author, commentator, and speaker, Major General Bakshi brings deep insight into China's strategic ambitions, regional security dynamics, and broad implication of developments affecting Tibet and Himalaya region. To you, sir.
Tuche. Honorable Sikyong, Penpa, Sheringla, Professor Srikanth, Kondapalli, Jayadeva, Ranade, Dr. Tenzin, Desal. It's a privilege to be here with my Tibetan friends. I have a deep, abiding, personal interest in Tibetan Buddhism. I studied the Tibetan language at the National Defense Academy. My Gagan was a Yingmapa Lama, Lama Thenle Dorji Bhutia, Khampa Lama from Ghum, Darjeeling, and from them I have always had an abiding love for things Tibetan, including and very specifically momos. You know, if you see the civilizational context, the Indian civilizational is characterized by its tolerance, encouragement of diversity, right? Whereas the Chinese civilization is characterized by a tendency to homogenize, to, enforce a kind of a uniformity, whether in language, whether in culture, whether in mores, whether in cultural norms. There is that dominant trend towards homogenization. The trend towards richness and diversity comes from the Lord Buddha's central tenet. You see, all Eastern religions, especially Indic religions, are experiential. In the Indian system of philosophy, it is Anubhav, Anubhuti, Darshan. It is a personal realization of the truth. The Tathagat, the Lord Buddha said, O monks, do not believe because I have said so. Do not believe because the wise are saying so. Experience for yourself and then believe. So the scope for individual expression of the truth is civilizationally the highest in the Indic civilization, and from there, it has gone to the, via the transmission of Buddhism to the same tolerance of, ambiguity, the same tolerance of diversity has expressed itself very much in the Tibetan culture. When we were outside having a cup of tea, I was just recounting to him a Tibetan proverb which says, Sacha rere, ke rere, Lama rere, choy rere. Each district, its own dialect, and every Lama, his own doctrine. He interprets it because of the simple fact that the Lord Buddha gave him the license to do so, to base his beliefs upon his experience. There is no canonization, there is no enforcement of the law, there are no heretics in Buddhism or in Hinduism, There is that freedom to experiential, to base your truths on your experiential reality. That is why this trend towards homogenization is disturbing. It's disturbing because it would mean the extinction of such rich cultures. Thank God for the Tibetan diaspora, because it has preserved the Tibetan language, the culture, the tradition. A lot of our own linguistic traditions, our own philosophical traditions were preserved in Tibet. And because they were preserved in Tibet, they were spared the invasions after invasions that the Indic civilization suffered. Nalanda burned for 6 months. There were so many books in Nalanda. And a lot of our philosophy, the Mahamudra philosophy of Nagarjun, the Vice Chancellor of Nalanda, went to Tibet, and Mahamudra was translated as Chakchen, Chakchenpo, Mahamudra, right? And from Chakchen it became Zazen when it went via China, Japan, this thing. So a lot of the Indic philosophical tradition has been preserved for us because it fortunately went into Tibet. And a lot of our Buddhist texts were preserved, and they were not burnt by, the various invaders who came over here. June is a very significant month for Tibet. 10th of June, if I remember correctly, then Mao Zedong had ordered the Second Field Army under Field Marshal Liu Po-cheng, so-called One-Eyed Dragon, to assimilate or to conquer Tibet, right? And the 8th Corps of the Second Field Army, along with the 133rd Infantry Division from their 46th Corps, they entered Lhasa 1951. He's already mentioned the treacherous 17-point agreement, which those Quislings had no authority to negotiate, right? But nevertheless, it was done. And then the induction of so much forces into Tibet destroyed the fragile economic, the very fragile ecology of Tibet. It can't sustain that many, along with the workforces which came to construct the roads. It created near famine conditions in Tibet. And then, initially the Chinese were very nice, very tolerant of the culture, etc., etc. But slowly, their whole attitude changed. And then they started, firstly confiscating the coins and everything from various households, monasteries, etc. And then, they started the disarming of the Khampas and the Golok tribes and the Amdo tribes in the eastern region. And that, by 1956, led to the revolt in Tibet, right? A military revolt in Tibet. And Tashi Andrut Chang, who organized that resistance movement called the Chushi Gangdru, 4 rivers, 6 mountains. You see, that was organized at that time. Contact was established with the CIA and the KMT, and number of the Khampas were taken to New Orleans, trained in paratrooping, parachuted back into Tibet, etc. And the major revolt broke out in 1956, which was crushed brutally. The Litang monastery was bombed and tanks were used. You see, there was no concept of what we have, what we call counter-insurgency warfare, in which we don't use heavy caliber weapons against our own misguided people or insurgents, etc. But, illusion bombers were used to bomb monasteries. And like I said, that revolt was crushed very brutally. It then shifted to the Lokha area north of Bhutan. I've just come back from Bhutan, where the army chief is a batchmate and a dear friend of mine. So that Lokha area opposite Bhutan was where this initial revolt was centralized. And when I was posted in Sikkim, I was telling Mr. Ranade that I happened to meet a number of the Khampa guerrillas who had operated in Tibet against the Chinese, and it was quite obviously interesting as a military professional to know of their experiences against the PLA. And then of course we know that the events that led to His Holiness having to flee his homeland of Tibet, the Khampas got him out and into India, and and from then the Chinese used that as a pretext to accuse India of interference, in a revolt which was entirely brewed by the CIA. Then this entire center focus of the resistance shifted to the Mustang area opposite Mustang. And then the CIA lost interest, wound up that proprietary airline in Kathmandu, and that was the end of the resistance. There were phases, again in the great cultural revolution, we had a phase of great repression in Tibet. About 1.2 million Tibetans have been killed, which included 4,80,000 in the Kham region alone. This is genocide on an unprecedented scale. Nevertheless, guided by His Holiness's, compassionate attitudes of Buddhist philosophy, they have always been asking for, autonomy. They have, eschewed the demand for independence, which had led to a military conflict. But with this latest law, as was highlighted by Sikyong Penpa Sheringla, there we see again in operation the Chinese insistence upon homogenization, which will, over a period of time, kill all these separate identities and sub-identities and cultures which are so rich linguistically, philosophically, culturally. They are distinct. They are so distinct. They have a rich history, especially going back to the Gesar of Ling, that great Tibetan king who had conquered up till Mongolia. China was once, also parts of China were under the Tibetan Empire. So I totally share this concern of the trend towards homogenization, towards the effacement of identities and cultures in the Chinese civilizational area, which poses a threat, very specific threat to the Tibetan identity, the Tibetan religion, Vajrayana Buddhism. This is the only source there, and with its, very rich art and culture. It would be a sad loss to humanity if this identity were to be effaced. And we would hope that, you know, the Chinese would be not so insistent upon this trend to homogenize the several rich cultures, languages, and religious identities in their body politic. Thank you for a patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Bakshi ji, for your speech. And now we have our second panelist, Mr. Jayadeva Ranade, the President of Center for China Analysis and Strategy here in Delhi. He is one of India's foremost expert on China, a former additional secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat of the Government of India. Mr. Ranade has spent decades studying China's political systems, foreign policy, military modernization, and intelligence apparatus. His extensive experience and scholarship have made him a respected authority on Asian geopolitics and India-China relations. His insights into China's evolving ethnic policies and their implications for Tibet are particularly valuable to today's discussion. To you, sir.
Good morning. Namaste and Tashidalek, I think, is the appropriate greeting for today. I think we've just heard two masterful, I'd call them, presentations by the Sikyong and General Bakshi, outlining what the concerns are, outlining what the expansive ambitions, if I may call it that, of the Chinese are. So I'll try and put it into context a little bit and start by saying that in effect this ethnic law, what it seeks to do is effect the erasure of the Tibetan civilization, to put it very simply. And in the process, what it is doing is changing history. The Chinese, incidentally, are pretty good at it. I will mention a few examples. But the key individual behind this effort is the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping. He is a princeling, as you all know, so he's certainly familiar with the use of power. He's grown up in that milieu, and he has effectively used the levers of power inside China. The various ethnic minorities, as he calls them, have been a focal point of his attention, and there has been a steady diminishing of their presence in critical bodies of the state apparatus that we have seen. And let me mention a couple of examples here. Firstly, this ethnic law, one understands that it was a concept that Xi Jinping had and mentioned in 2016. So it dates back to then. He's been working on it, or his people have. And a major step that he did take was the strengthening of the United Front Work Department. And here I'll digress maybe a little bit. The United Front Work Department, in 2016, he expanded the organization. It's a party organization. He doubled its strength, he doubled its budget, and he gave it greater freedom to operate. Now, the United Front Work Department is supposed to handle all matters relating to ethnic minorities and others, non-communist entities inside China and abroad. But it doesn't stop there. And it actually targets every country where the governments are not autocratic, they're democratic governments. And here I must mention a couple of examples. In India, we are a very, very free society, probably the freest in the world. We have no controls on our citizens. They can say what they like, even if it discomfits the governments or authorities. They can behave as they want. Sometimes, some of us object to it. But we are a free society. Anyone can come in, anyone can go out. And I'll give you one example, which many of you, it might click with you. We introduced what is called the Aadhaar card, which is a representation of, who you are. and yet it doesn't confirm your nationality. It's a card anyone can come and take. So that's the kind of, I think, what you alluded to, the freedom that we have. But along with this comes risks. And the United Front Work Department poses such a risk, or a threat, I should say. They infiltrate the society, they use their money and penetrate academics, politicians, the bureaucracy. I mean, they enter the social fabric of a society. It's not only here. France has recently shut down so-called 9 Chinese police stations, which they uncovered. There are many more in the UK and other places. And mind you, these countries have slightly stricter regulations than we do. But they have come in. So it's not just the Tibetans whom they're trying to, shall I use the word tame or subvert, or suppress, but they're trying to, as General Bakshi said, homogenize the thinking of the world. And here we come to what Xi Jinping has advanced. He has said that he wants China by 2049, he's specified a date, to be a power that can influence, or that will have global influence, which means, and the way he has put it, it should be able to set up or influence international organizations. So 2049 is his target date, and the way he has put it means he wants to either rival or surpass the United States of America. And that is the rivalry that we are seeing today. So when we look at this ethnic law, when we look at what's happening to Tibet or Tibetans, it is in this context that we need to look at it. The law itself follows a series of systematic steps that have taken place. First, it started with the surveillance systems that were brought in. Today, Tibet is a paradise for security specialists and for autocrats, because everything that they do is monitored. Whether it's the phone, whether it's the email, whether it's personal meetings, whether it's their interaction with their children or amongst themselves in a family. It's monitored. So it's that intensive monitoring that is taking place. The second was the religion. They began trying to tackle the religion and telling the monks to adapt Tibetan Buddhism to socialism with Chinese characteristics. And the monks were particularly targeted. In fact, there was a very senior faculty member of the Central Party School. As you know, that is the school which trains the cadres to occupy top positions. In fact, the joke on that Central Party School is that people follow the traffic rules within the party campus, school campus, because they don't know who's going to become the general secretary of the party. So they're very careful. But out there, they have this system of coming in. And they identified this lady called Chin Wei. She wrote a particularly unusual piece where she identified the monks as the real troublemakers in Tibet. She said, because they exercise a lot of influence. So she said, they're the ones whom we have to target, we have to work on and persuade them. They're still persuading. 70 years, I think, of occupation, but they're still working at it. The language was the next step. Again here, they felt, and correctly, that if they can either dilute or eliminate the language, the people's link with their history is gone. And that is what is happening. Earlier, they said no Tibetan will be taught in the special schools outside the Tibet Autonomous Region. Now it is even inside the Tibet Autonomous Region. Tibetan has been stopped, they've stopped teaching Tibetan. The idea is that in course of time, the youngsters do not speak Tibetan. They are also trying to discourage parents from talking to their children in Tibetan. Obviously, if they speak in Tibetan, their Chinese will be weaker, they won't get jobs, which are all provided by the state. So it's step by step. The ethnic law itself, I was looking at it, it's already been mentioned about harmonization, etc. But it was interesting that the person in charge of the drafting committee of this law, and I mentioned, I'll clarify why I'm mentioning it, is an individual called Li Hongchun. He is a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, which supervises the United Front Work Department. And he is an acolyte of Xi Jinping. He is the individual who, when Xi Jinping started his career as the party chief, in 2013 he said, China has, under Xi Jinping, now embarked on a new 30-year era, like those of Mao and Tang before him. So this is the care that has been taken in ensuring that the ethnic law meets the requirements of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. And the various provisions that it contains are in sync, therefore, with what the leadership has thought so. In conclusion, let me just say that the fact that they have taken such care to do all these things and bring it in, to an extent also indicates the vulnerabilities that they feel still persist, that they are not able to really enforce it. As I said, 70 years they still got to convince the monks and the Tibetans to adapt Tibetan Buddhism to socialism with Chinese characteristics. They still have to try and persuade them through other methods of complying with the state. So they have things like, I forget the exact definition, but throughout Tibet, a party member is allotted one household. Household would normally mean 3 to 4 people. He's allotted that household, and it entails his visiting that household, from what we have gathered, at least once a week or and staying there. So he takes his rations with him and stays in the household. Now houses are small, 1 room, maybe 1.5 rooms. So he's privy to whatever goes on in the house. That is the kind of intrusive thing that they're trying to do. The second thing, which is not very noticeable, because it gets covered up by the developmental activities that are taking place, is the accelerated and intensified mining that is going on in Tibet. And in addition to that, this new dam which they are building, which is the biggest dam in the world, 3 times the size of the 3 gorges in Sichuan, just across us in Metok County of Arunachal Pradesh. The plans, we are not yet clear whether it's just for power generation or whether it will divert the Brahmaputra. That's still not clear. But they have inducted lots and lots, in fact hundreds and thousands by their figures, of people from the mainland to work on these projects. So what is happening is that there is a gradual change in the demographic balance of Tibet. A lot of roads are coming up, a lot of railway lines are coming up. That's of concern to you, actually, and all of us. 35 airfields are coming up by 2049. That's the target date. Whom are these for? That's a question, of course, we are asking. So I'll just say, I'll conclude here, that when the Chinese use phrases like harmony, like community with a shared destiny, these are loaded comments. They appear very benign, but they are not. And let me illustrate this with, I had gone to Harvard University, not that I was exceptionally bright, but I was posted in Washington. I went to give a talk there. And in that class, the lecturer, he made some comments, slightly disparaging about India. So I countered them. But, and then he said, you know, I throw this open to the class, anyone has a comment. And a Chinese who was there, a dissident as it turns out, raised his hand and said, I have a comment to make. So he challenged his tutor. And he said, you know, you don't understand China. This is this Chinese guy telling him, and the class. He said, in China, if there is a problem, if we don't get food or if there is no water, our voices are not heard. We can't say anything. The moment we say it, it's shut down. In India, if this happens, people start making a noise, and the noise is fairly loud. Everyone pays attention to it, and the problem is resolved. He says that is the difference between China and India. So in a way, we've got a lot of things that even others point to. And finally, let me just conclude by making one observation or two. One is that this, the title says Law of the People's Republic of China on promoting ethnic unity, etc., which means they still have a lot of efforts to make. Second, it's coming at a very critical time. And this I would like to flag to everyone. It's coming at a crucial juncture, at a time of transition for the Tibetan community. And this is the time when the Chinese would probably calculate that they have the freedom to make a push for this kind of a law. So I'll conclude here, but I'll just say that this law is certainly not benign. It's a very loaded kind of a law, which I think the international community needs to take up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now next we have our panelist, Dr. Tenzin Desal. Dr. Tenzin Desal is Senior Fellow at the Tibet Policy Institute of Central Tibet Administration and also the editor of Tibet Policy Journal. His research focuses on Chinese governance in Tibet, cultural preservation, and the impact of state policies on Tibetan identity. Through his scholarly work and policy analysis, he has contributed significantly to understanding the challenges confronting Tibetans under current Chinese policies. Today, he will share his perspectives and expertise on the implications of China's new ethnic law, so-called new ethnic unity law, for the future of Tibetan language, culture, and identity. Before you go in, I would like to once again request all of you who seated here to move this side of the corner so that we have a lot of space here. Our speakers could see you right in. Here we have a lot of space. Thank you very much. To you, Dr. Desal.
Hello. Well, thank you, Chair. I'm truly humbled to be speaking and sitting on the panel along with esteemed speakers. And it's always a very tough act to follow once when you have incredible speakers ahead of you. So I'll try to attempt to, my scope of my presentation, I'll just limit it to really trying to contextualize what this ethnic unity law is, and then try to give you the genesis of this law and why China is pushing towards it. Before even contextualizing the genesis of this law, I think it's very important to really think about how state and society is organized. And in a post-Westphalian state, when you have a democratic, healthy society, the state-making and nation-building tend to go together hand in hand. So that's how many of the states in democratic countries are healthy state. But when you look at China, as Jayadeva Ranade has alluded to about the fact that it has still a long way to go in attempting towards generating and fostering this sort of identity, it is a clear indication that the nation building has failed. But when it comes to state making, we all know that China has been building enormous infrastructure, the dams and all the wonders, the engineering feats and everything. But there's a failure when it comes to nation building. And I think this is where the context, this is where the interrogation and the genesis of this law lies. And before we can try to understand what China is trying to do, and I think when we say China's approach towards Tibet or China policy towards Tibet, this is why we have to think in terms of two strands of China's Tibet policy. One is to look at the state-making process, which is, by all accounts, they have been building railways and roads and this enormous infrastructure developments and everything. And then there's this another process, which is the question of belonging. And I think this is where the Tibetans, if you look at the history of Tibetan and the China's rule in Tibet, and I think this is the side where we have to interrogate in trying to contextualize the genesis of this law. Now, if you look at the long history of China's approach towards Tibet, particularly in terms of the questioning around the nation building and the question of belonging, the Tibetan belonging to PRC, we can always go back to 1950s, and Honorable Sikyong alluded about this instrument that was forced, the so-called 17-point agreement was sort of a legal instrument to steer Tibet towards within the fold of PRC. And we all know that this is a failure. And His Holiness, when he stepped into India, he rejected all the terms that was outlined in the 17-point agreement in spirit and in letter. So that was the first instrument that China attempted to do through sheer military force. Now, pulling back a little bit, Tibet went through this very deep and horrifying period called the democratic reform, which was fundamentally China trying to force upon the Tibetan people its revolution, Chinese revolution on the Tibetan people. It's not Tibetan revolution. It's not the Tibetan people seeking revolution within the Tibetan society. It's a Chinese revolution imposed on the Tibetan people. And I think, you know, if it's quite, you know, if you put this one in historical context, it's very patronizing to say that, okay, you seemed underdeveloped, so I'm going to bring a revolution to you. That kind of patronizing attitude was assumed by the PRC towards the Tibetan people. So this revolution, democratic, it was very, very deeply violent part of the Tibetan history, 1958 to 1962. And Panchen Lama, the previous Panchen Lama, he wrote this very important report called the 70,000 character petition in Chinese language, and he presented it to Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong characterized this document as a poisoned arrow directed at the party. Now, what are the details outlined in that document? This document basically outlined mass destruction of monasteries, mass starvation, mass killing, and basically China's attempting to fundamentally transform the Tibetan society. And for this, we all know the Panchen Lama underwent this very rigorous and very grueling period in Chinese incarceration. So that was the period from 1958 to 62. And then 1965, again, it's a power struggle in Zhongnanhai, a power struggle within elite power politics that led to what is referred to as the Cultural Revolution. That also spilled into Tibet, and Tibet underwent through another dark period from 1965. And there's a lot of debate within academics of Tibetan studies whether the Chinese Cultural Revolution in Tibet ended at 1975 because the impacts and the practices of Cultural Revolution continued late into 1970s also. So that was the period. And then somebody by name Hu Yaobang came, and then there was this sort of an approach where he thought that, okay, whatever we have been doing in the last many decades has been a complete failure, and we have to seek a new approach towards the Tibetan people. So in 1980, there's this very famous speech that he delivered in Lhasa, where he was speaking to the cadres, the PRC cadres, the CPC cadres in Lhasa, basically saying that we have been spending enormous amount of resources into Tibet. We have been doing everything. We have been doing everything that the state can master, anything that the party can offer, but still we haven't been able to bring the Tibetan into the Chinese fold. And there's this very interesting remark that he made that, all these resources that we have spent on Tibet, has this been drowned into the Kichu River? So the Kichu River is a river that flows next to the Potala Palace in Lhasa. So that was the comment that he made. And at that point of time, there was this sort of opening for reconciliation, sort of a small opening for engagement. Yet, nevertheless, 1980s and late 1980s. Now, if you look at the protests, the whole-scale protests within Tibet, and the Tibetan people resisting China's rule in Tibet, I think there's this various phases that I've mentioned. And in 1980s, from 1986 to 89, there was this mass protest in Lhasa. But if you zoom out and look at the protests and resistance of the Tibetan people against China rule, most of the protests up until then tend to be extremely localized in many of the regions in Tibet. So 1986 to 89, there was this huge upswing of Tibetan protests in Tibet, were largely localized within the Lhasa territory. And if you all recall, in 2008, Beijing was going to hold the Olympics in 2008, and it was sort of coming to the global stage moment for the People's Republic of China. And in Tibet, protests began in March of 2008, and if you map the series of protests that continued from March, if you map the series of protests from then onwards, it is a pan-Tibetan protest. So if I can get you a map, and then if you take a pin and they say, okay, on March there was a protest in this region, this region. It was remarkable in a sense that 2008 was a pan-Tibetan protest movement. Tibetans from across the Tibetan plateau rose up and sort of protested against the China's rule in Tibet. And from then onwards, there was this reckoning in China. There was reckoning in China where they were saying that, okay, whatever we have been doing is completely wrong. We need a new approach towards the so-called minorities. So the scholars came up with something called the new generation of ethic law. A new generation of ethic law championed by scholars such as Ma Rong, essentially saying that we need to, well, he put it in a very academic form where he said that we need to depoliticize ethnic identity. What it essentially means is that we need to erase the differences of identity within the People's Republic of China. So how this, as a concept, how can you actually implement this one in practice? And I think this is essentially, this law is essentially a distillation of the idea and codification of the idea. So now if you, in 2010, Tibet Walk Forum, the 5th Tibet Walk Forum was held in Beijing. So if you are familiar with Tibet in China, Tibet Walk Forum is the biggest platform where China deliberates policies and issues regarding Tibet. And in 2010, at the 5th Walk Forum, there was a formulation which was made, and I think it's quite interesting to note that up until then, the approach towards Tibet was very fragmented. So China had policies and measures for Tibet Autonomous Region, distinct policies, and then they had measures in various other Tibetan regions, which is spliced, mutilated, and being attached to other provinces of China. If you are familiar with the geography, Tibetan region is spliced and mutilated and added and appended to other Chinese provinces in the eastern region. So in this policy forum, essentially reframed China's approach towards Tibet and said, okay, we need a new approach where we have to consider Tibetan issue not just within the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but every area where the Tibetans are inhabiting. I think this is a fundamental and an inflection point, a watershed moment in China's approach, particularly in terms of how they manage diversity within People's Republic of China. Now, this new generation of ethnic law, previously it was purely an academic discussion where they said, oh, we have to depoliticize ethnic identity. But right now, once when you look at this law, what it essentially does is that it codifies those ideas, distill those ideas, and then put them into practice. And if you look at one of the provisions within this law, it essentially says that every local government, in practice, have to bring in measures where they will integrate Tibetans with the other nationalities and other identities. So what it does is that the local authorities must produce activities. They will have to send in a report eventually, but they will have to prove that within schools, within administration, within every levels of government, they have to prove integration. So in a Tibetan school, they will have to bring in, essentially what this law directs is essentially to bring in other children from other regions and then sort of assimilate and then forging of this new identity. Now, how can we resolve this idea? How do we come to a resolution? How can we really understand the logic and how it is operating on the ground level? And I think for me, fundamentally, China is attempting to in practice, what China is doing is through what I've been referring to as severance. Severance at two levels. One form of severance is all the laws and all policies are operating at two levels. The severance of intergenerational memories and connection, and severance of Tibetans within Tibet and Tibetans in exile. And I think this is something that we really have to be extremely careful and be attentive about. Intergenerational severance, what do I mean by that? Since over the last decade, we have come to know that children from age 4 to 8, over 80% of children are ripped apart from their family members and then inducted into what is essentially a colonial boarding schools. They are being inducted to learn Chinese history, Chinese culture, the medium of instruction is Chinese. So they are being transformed. This intergenerational severance is operating at one level, and then at the second level, severance of connection between Tibetans in exile and within Tibet. And one of the things which is very distinctive about exile Tibetan movement is this cohesion of the Tibetan movement. And I think nobody in the world has ever questioned the leadership of His Holiness or the leadership of the exile administration in leading the Tibetan movement. And you cannot say that about many other movements. Many other movements, the questions are raised, oh, how do you get to represent so-and-so movement? But Tibetan movement had never encountered this question. And how do we have that form of legitimacy is through the cohesion that the Tibetan movement has maintained through amplifying of the voices of Tibetans within Tibet. And I think this is fundamentally very important to understand that if we have maintained this cohesion of movement within Tibet and outside Tibet. And since 2008, the numbers of Tibetans coming from Tibet to India has dwindled. And I think I'll give you another I'll just end my presentation by giving you another factual remark, and I'll end my presentation, and then I'll come back to why the propensity towards implementation of this law is China now spends more money in maintaining internal security in Tibet than maintaining the external security. Now, just try to imagine that, like, let this sink in. They are spending a lot more money in maintaining internal security within Tibet than securing its border. Like, Tibet shares a lot of borders with many other countries, but they are spending a lot more money in Tibet. And I think this is where the challenge lies. And I think the international community will have to look at these two forms of severance, and we should do everything so that we can retain the cohesion of the Tibetan movement. And I think this is a perfect platform to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Desal. Now we come to the concluding remark by Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. Professor Srikanth Kondapalli is one of India's most respected scholar on China and professor of Chinese studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University here in Delhi. He has devoted more than 3 decades to the study of Chinese politics, foreign policy, security affairs, and India-China relations. His scholarship has informed policymakers, strategic communities, and academic institutions across India and beyond. We look forward to his reflection on today's discussion and the broader implications of China's so-called ethnic unity in Tibet. To you, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me also thank the TPI for the invite. So we had very good presentations this morning. The Sikyong, Honorable Sikyong spoke about the various identities that Tibet had for over centuries, and General Bakshi recalled the history since 1950s, Liu Pocheng, and the campaigns that were launched. We also had Mr. Ranade speaking about the ethnic law erasing the Tibetan identities, and just now Tenzin Desal spoke about the efforts made by China to erase these identities in a systematic manner. So one of the things so this ethnic law is called new, and which basically means in China since 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, everything has been said as part of the new era. So they wanted to basically move beyond Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping's eras. There's a Chinese proverb, San Shinian Hashi, San Shinian Hatung, which basically means every 30 years things go to the opposite and you need to restart. So Xi Jinping began a restarting of the bygone eras and wants to put across some new things. So this is called generally the new era. So what was there during Mao Zedong's time and Deng Xiaoping's time, and what is new about Xi Jinping? So Mao Zedong adopted the Soviet definition on the national minorities. The Soviet national minorities definition was coined by Stalin, Joseph Stalin. So he defined generally any minority as a historical community sharing a language, sharing religious belief systems, confined to a kind of territory and so on. This has been adopted by many countries, including to an extent India, in terms of the Kashmir identity, Naga identity, or other identities in Northeast. So there was some, under Nehruvian planning system, we had some influence of those definitions from Stalin. In the case of China, the Li Weihan defined the Chinese minorities, and there are about 56. They also include Tibet into this. And they say Tibet has been part of China since Han Dynasty, while the CTA and the Tibetan community say they were never part of China. So there is this distinction between the two, Chinese and Tibetans on. But Li Weihan defined the ethnic minorities, and his effort was basically to co-opt the minorities in the rest of China. So you have the Uyghurs, the various other Tibetan, Mongol, and other minorities, the Huizu and others. So there was these delegations sent to these minority areas, and the effort was to co-opt them into the PRC system. So initially in September 1949, there was the common program that was enacted, which formed the basis for social contract between the Communist Party and the people and the ethnic minorities in China. So it mentions about some rights for the minorities. They said you have the language, you have the religious belief systems, you have the marriage patterns. For example, the Huizu and the Uyghurs, they have polygamy, and they also have since the 1970s, when one-child policy was adopted, this was not implemented in the minority regions. So in other words, they had some autonomy in the sense of the marriage patterns, religious issues, and a host of other things. So the Li Weihan's mission was to co-opt these ethnic minorities into the PRC, and then a whole set of things were enunciated. So China had about 4 constitutions. The first constitution provided substantial rights, autonomy to the ethnic minorities, including in the areas that I just mentioned. The Constitution of 1952 is quite liberal in nature in the sense of the autonomy, etc. But the Constitution of 75 and 77 were extreme. The 82 Constitution restored some of these autonomy aspects of the ethnic minorities. So the crucial word here from Stalin's definition and the trends that we saw was assimilation and autonomy. Assimilation and national integration. In national integration, you co-opt the ethnic minorities by providing them autonomy, genuine autonomy sometimes. In many of the, if you look at Kazakh Soviet Republic, they had autonomy in terms of the religious or language, codification of the language. In Caucasus, in Eurasian region during the Soviet times. By the way, we also followed the national integration policies. We have a National Integration Council as a whole, which would discuss the ethnic minorities issues in India, the parliamentary committees which went into these aspects. So you have national integration, you have assimilation. So the second constitution, the third constitution in 75 and 77 introduced a lot of assimilation policies, which is where you have 1 million Tibetans were killed, 6,000 monasteries were demolished, and the Greatly Forward Cultural Revolution impact had substantial damage to the Tibetan identity and religious or other ethnic minorities' identities and religious belief systems. So these two policies now, in the 82 constitution also there is the national integration rather than assimilation. So what has happened during Xi Jinping's era, the new era, is the assimilation policies are now coming back again, and this new ethnic law, the China's new ethnic law, then represents the new era of Xi Jinping, in which there is the assimilation practiced substantially. Tenzin Desal mentioned just now about the effort that Xi Jinping made, various delegations that have gone into ethnic minority regions in order to implement this assimilation policy. So August 2020, the Tibet Forum meeting decided about Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism. So that is where the assimilation policy is quite pronounced in nature. There is also the colonial boarding houses. The Tibetan children as young as 4 years old picked up, and the effort was to completely reboot their identities. These children are grown in those schools where you have Chinese festivals rather than, say, Tibetan festivals celebrated. Completely culturally, there is the assimilation that is proposed in those colonial boarding houses. Now, one of the things in the law, in the new law, is Article 63. There are 63 articles, and Article 63 speaks about any organization, any individual who has a contrarian view about these would be penalized by the PRC, which is what the Sikyong was mentioning, that Mr. Ranade will be arrested, General Bakshi will be arrested, or this is nothing new, by the way. The national security law of Hong Kong has that provision. If any of you are passing through Hong Kong, and if any of you have written anything remotely critical of China, you will be arrested, by the way. So they have experimented this from 2022 and reinforced in 2024 the national security law in Hong Kong. But I wanted to also get back to the 19th Communist Party Congress. In its resolution mentioned 6 no's. No individual, no organization, no institution, no country, etc., etc. 6 no's would divide China from the rest of its parts. Meaning here, basically, they mentioned Taiwan. This is in 2017. But today, this new law, ethnic law, mentions about that in relation to Tibet. So what China did was to extend the Taiwan 6 no's to the 2 no's on Tibet. This is what the extension would mean. And so in other words, China is now putting it across to all domains about these 6 no's. In the case of Tibet, 2 no's. And penalizing those who have a different view than compared with the national integration proposals. So I think that is the most important transition from the 19th Communist Party Congress to the March enactment of this new ethnic law, number one. Number two, I think the person behind this is Wang Huning, who is a 4th ranking Politburo Standing Committee member, who visited Gadze and who is said to be the script writer for Chiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now currently Xi Jinping. We do not know whether he will remain in the 21st Party Congress next year, but nevertheless, he has been writing the scripts, and he was the one who had introduced many of these assimilation policies also in ethnic minority regions. So I think that is crucial, and we need to watch out on his further. The second aspect which is important, and a transition here we also see, is this new ethnic law mentions about the community of Chinese people. what the Sikyong had mentioned about the Chunghua Minchu, and what it actually means is again a transition. Previously, the Chinese Communist Party was suggesting we want to build a community of common destiny. This is for the external sector, but the community of Chinese people is for the domestic sector, including for the ethnic minorities. So the difference here is the community of shared destiny that they have mentioned for the other countries. By the way, today there are 15 countries which have signed into this. 5 ASEAN countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, 5 Central Asian republics. All of them have subscribed to this community of shared destiny. So Xi Jinping mentioned this in the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, where he defined what the community of shared destiny is. He said that this is a kind of partnership, economy, society, and all the other things, partnerships. But to my mind, what is important is that this is a kind of alliance that China intends to cobble up with the neighboring countries or other countries. It is likely that China will propose this to many of the Belt and Road Initiative contracting countries to sign into the community of shared destiny. So China wants to create a kind of cushion, something like NATO. Of course, NATO is disintegrating today, but something like NATO, something like a military partnership, alliance partnerships with other countries. The proposal here on a community of Chinese people indicates that China wants to militarize some of these ethnic minority regions. They are already militarized, but in terms of ethnicity, the militarization here is quite possible. So one is at the level of external domain, neighborhood, community of shared destiny, and for the ethnic minorities, community of Chinese people. So this is what the Chinese preparations in the long term is. And so we need to watch out what exactly are the building blocks of this community of Chinese people. I mean, the law was very clear in terms of what it is going to have. For example, Article 15 mentions about the identity as a whole Chinese people rather than Tibetan identity, Uyghur identity, Huizu identity, or Mongolian identity. Second is the one of the most crucial things here is obligations of citizens, families, and even children. This is the most draconian aspect of this new law. In other words, they are trying to say that even children have to obey what China is arguing in ethnic minority regions. This is in violation of all the international child conventions. You cannot have innocent citizens, especially children, coerced in accepting many of the provisions of this law. So I think this is the most brutal as well as weaponized way of treating children. I think this would be, this is in violation of the Chinese constitution, but also about international conventions, which is where I think the CTA and TPI and other organizations need to substantially work on. And but also crucially, Article 46 mentions about borders. It mentions about military-civil fusion. It mentions about the PLA presence in terms of the new ethnic law. So the neighboring countries, including India, Bhutan, Nepal, Myanmar, others are also involved in terms of this law. So I think we need to be watching out what it is going to impact. We already saw the land border law has been passed several years ago. Cao Chung-chi, who served in the Western Theatre Command, has become the National People's Congress Deputy Director in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he passed this. He helped pass this national land border law. And so there is the weaponization even in the neighborhood. that we need to be cautious about. And this law also has implications for the neighboring countries. It's not just about the Tibetan ethnic community, but also the Trans-Himalayan region, let me put it in this way. And that would be crucial for the 5 Himalayan states that India borders with Tibet. And so there is an issue here in terms of our own national security or Bhutanese-Nepalese border security. This should be combined in the sense of the well-off society villages that China has constructed, 628 of these, bordering the Trans-Himalayan region. And so that is important. Let me mention a few things about Tibet. Chen Chuanko was the party secretary in Tibet in 2011 to 2016. Then he was transferred to Xinjiang. Chen Chuanko introduced what they call as strike hard policies. And this includes creation of blockchain databases, mass surveillance, and huge efforts in controlling. So social media monitoring, facial recognition CCTV cameras were installed every 100 meters in Lhasa. These CCTV cameras were put up, and surveillance systems have been introduced. One of the things that I want to mention is the universal forensic extraction devices. So your mobile phone will be downloaded in 3 minutes in Tibet. All your contents will be taken away, and you need to explain why are you talking to XYZ based on your contacts in your mobile phone. So that is what they introduced in Tibet, and this is now being expanded to Xinjiang and to other parts of China. Number one. Number two, most again weaponized one is the double-linked household system. Double-linked household system means if a Tibetan family has, say, 3 or 4 members or more, each member will explain to the public security what the other person in the family has done that whole day. If that person has any views regarding the monastery, views regarding the monks, views regarding China, views regarding the public security system. So they will mention about these, and the other member also complains against. This is a cultural revolution policy of criticizing each other. The wife complains against the husband, the children complain against the parents, and the student against the teacher. What we saw during the Cultural Revolution, the 4 olds to be abolished, and this is basically an anti-Confucius 5 great relationships. So this is what China is introducing in Tibet with this double-linked household system, which means every Tibetan family will be kind of weaponized, every member will be weaponized, in order to serve the public security system. So what we are going to witness is the social cohesion is disrupted within the Tibetan family system, as we saw during the Cultural Revolution. So that is the most dangerous. The cohesion. The second cohesion is about 40 to 45% of Tibetans are basically nomads. Today, with the ghettos being built all across, by China, China had reduced these nomadic communities to 15 to 20%. So in other words, everyone is brought into these ghettos so that the surveillance systems are very intense, centralized, monitoring the Tibetans. Now today that is gone with these settlements, Tibetan settlements, where these nomads are brought into these households. So that is what Chen Chuanko has made in Tibet and Xinjiang after his term in Tibet. So those are the things that I would like to highlight here to say that the ethnic law, the new ethnic law, has provisions of intensifying the assimilation. Now, what should we do in regard to the new ethnic law? I think that is most important. What should the TPI do? That is what I would like to say. TPI needs to extensively write and analyze about each of the provisions of this law in relation to, and this is a very good paper that has been circulated, in terms of the contradiction with what the Chinese themselves have said in the Common Program and the 4 constitutions, and also the regional autonomy law that has been passed and amended subsequently. And in comparison to the international laws, the human rights. Of course, China has become a member of the Human Rights Council. So you can see the problem here of how international law can also be tweaked. China is a member. China has become head of the 5 or 6 UN bodies because its influence has grown, and including the Human Rights Council. So we hardly have any scope here in terms of the international law. But what TPI could do is to extensively write on these, to disseminate these in the public domain. Second, the democratic countries need to examine these provisions extensively and write about these again to alert the different countries, and the parliaments, more important, also need to discuss these issues. We have a parliamentary committee in relation to the to China, to Tibet, Xinjiang, and other areas. So that needs to be, but not just this, but other democratic countries as well. This paper has something related to EU, US, and other countries, but more countries could be mobilized in looking at these provisions and resolutions to be passed in the parliament. It doesn't make much sense, but much publicity, but it is important that these parliaments have to make. Finally, I would say that the most important thing is the Tibetans need to struggle. That is where the strength is. All the other things are peripheral. Parliamentary resolutions, the TPI conducting academic research or policy research, this would be peripheral. The most crucial thing is the Tibetans need to find innovative ways of struggle. That is where I think the crux of the matter is. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kondapalli, for the concluding remark. Now, as all the experts highlighted here, please allow me to re-emphasize on few aspects. The international community must not be misled by the language of unity and progress. The true test of any law lies not in its title but in its consequences. If implemented as intended, China's so-called new ethnic unity law will accelerate the assimilation of Tibetans, weaken the foundation of Tibetan civilization, and further endanger the survival of Tibet's language, culture, religion, and identity under Chinese occupation. The world must therefore recognize this legislation for what it truly is, not an instrument of ethnic unity, but a legal framework designed to systematically erode and ultimately eliminate the distinct historical, linguistic, cultural, and national identity of the Tibetan people and other peoples living under Chinese occupation. By targeting the foundation of collective identity and accelerating forced assimilation, this law introduced by Chinese government constitutes a grave step towards genocide and raises serious concern about a genocide in the making in Tibet under Chinese occupation. Therefore, governments, international organizations, scholars, human rights advocates, Buddhist communities, independent media, and all the defenders of freedom, human dignity, and cultural diversity must join together in condemning the implementation of this law and demanding its immediate repeal. Thank you very much. Now, with this, we come to the concluding session, and we'll open to the media first for Q&A, and then if there's time, we also open to others, please.
Good afternoon. This is Yeshi Seli. I work for a magazine called Business India. I have 2 questions. One is for Sikyong. How much is CTA able to do in terms of preserving the Tibetan language, culture, and identity? And also, you know, we have to bear in mind that China has very strong trade ties with most parts of the world. If I remember correctly, you said that from 1st of July, you're going to kick off this campaign where you're going to talk about China's new ethnic law. So how optimistic are you of getting support on that front, considering the fact that people across the world are dependent on China for trade, for a lot of things? And for you, General Bakshi, I have a question. You know, India is also trying to, there's some sense of normalizing of ties with China. So how would we balance out our equation with the CTA and His Holiness and the ties that we are trying to normalize or have already, you know, walked that path of bilateral cooperation with China?
Maybe I'll start before responding to your question. Just want to make a remark about how we need to understand China and how they are approaching the world and how they are approaching the challenges within their territories. So if you look at the new ethnic unity law, that is meant for now Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongols, and also other minorities within China. For the Taiwanese, you have the anti-separatist law. For the Hong Kong, you have the national security law. So you have all these laws for different regions with different challenges, and we have to look at in detail how they are managing all this, meeting all these challenges with all these beautiful names, but with very sinister objectives. The CTA, under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we never thought that we will have to live in exile for this long, already 66 years, 67 years. But His Holiness was always a visionary. That's why as soon as he reached India, not even 1 year after coming into exile, His Holiness introduced democracy. And then with Pandit Nehru wrote to all the chief ministers. That is how we started our compact communities in India, which of course we are facing challenges now of dispersal of the young generation to other places, but we are meeting those challenges as well. So, so wherever there is a sizable number of Tibetans, here in India or Nepal or Bhutan or elsewhere around the world, we have Tibetan associations or Tibetan communities. So all these Tibetan communities, particularly in India, have been very, very instrumental in the preservation of our language, our cultural institutions and religious institutions. So we have, I think one of the panelists here mentioned about the resilience of the Tibetan people in rebuilding many of the things that China destroyed during the Cultural Revolution and during other periods. So we have these big monasteries in India with 5,000, 6,000 monks in South India. So that's how we try to preserve Tibetan Buddhism, and along with that, Tibetan language and Tibetan culture. It is, of course, a challenge for us. Now we are resettled in more than 28 different countries. So in some countries, we are small in number. But despite all that, we run about 92 weekend Tibetan classes and cultural classes all over the world, wherever there are Tibetan communities. So everybody is making an effort. But if you ask me, is it enough? It is definitely not enough, because we are now displaced in different places. We are born in different environment, and it is always a challenge. So we'll have to work harder to make sure that we carry on with the work that His Holiness has started. Even at 91, His Holiness is going to be 91 this year. So even at this age, he constantly keeps encouraging the Tibetans to do what we have been doing. And His Holiness is not focused only on political issues. His Holiness always says that preservation of your language, culture, and religion are also part of your struggle, a major part of our struggle. So, irrespective of what China is doing, what the consequences will be on the Tibetans, however detrimental, we will continue to preserve and continue to promote Tibetan language and culture in the diaspora community. And in terms of campaign, you know that we have 12 offices around the world, from Tokyo to Taipei to Canberra to Delhi, Kathmandu, Moscow. Now, of course, Moscow is not running anymore. We have offices in London, in Brussels, Geneva, smaller office in Paris, one in Sao Paulo, and one for North America in Washington, D.C. So through these offices, we reach out. We have instructed all our representatives in these offices to reach out to as many governments as possible under their jurisdiction, reach out to foreign officers, reach out to think tanks, organize press conferences, as many as possible, to create awareness on what China is doing with this new so-called Ethnic Unity and Progress law. This was passed on March 12th in China. And in a few days, the Czech Senate, because the Czech senators were there in Dharamsala on 10th March, and immediately upon their return in Czech Republic, they passed a resolution. I just went to Germany and United States. Drafts for resolutions are being circulated in the Congress, so we are working very hard on this, and a lot of other people are also working with other parliaments, which Professor Kondapalli mentioned. We already have a lot of connections with members in different countries. In some countries we have more governmental support, in some countries less governmental support. But despite whether we have governmental support or not, even if it's a consortium of a group of members of parliament in different countries, including Latin America, we will be moving in these directions. So we will be activating all our networks, including WeTAC, the Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group, to push our understanding of what this law means for us and the consequences it will have. It's always very important to create more awareness. Without awareness, you cannot seek support. And if you don't understand what China is doing, then you cannot confront what China is doing. So we will definitely be working more vigorously with all stakeholders internationally. We have already started the process. The background materials are already here. It just needs a cover letter to be sent to governments to make them understand what China is doing.
You know, the world has been hit by a creative storm, you know, creative destruction, not Schumpeter's creative destruction, but a destruction called Donald J. Trump Jr. You see, as long as that turbulence is there, I think a lot of what we understood of geopolitics has been stood on its head. You see, the Iran conflict, I mean, just to sort of give you an example, I think it is a seminal conflict of this century which would decide whether Donald Trump would be able to bully us back into a unipolar world order, or we have now fully transited to multipolarity. Now, multipolar power equations were there in World War I and they were there in World War II. And their primary characteristic is quick alignments and realignments. If you see World War II, the parties that started the war, Italy was part of the fascist bloc and then it had joined the Allies. Russia and Germany, Nazi Germany, had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then they were the most serious contestants in that war. So there will be this period of quick alignments and realignments. And for the time being, I would of course request the views of my very, valued sinologists who are here. But what we see is there might be a modus vivendi. China believes in a single front, single strategic direction. That direction we see as Taiwan and the South China Sea, the East Coast. Would it be interested in trying to pick trouble on its extreme western flank? The indications are different. The indications are not indicative of that. So there is definitely a kind of a thaw. Whether it is how long it will last, we don't know. But there's definitely a thaw in the relations between, and the drift towards a Russia, India, China kind of a triangle configuration in global politics. But then, things are changing so rapidly that there is a level of disorientation, and I would very much request the views of Kondapalli ji and Jayadeva ji on this seminal question of China and India.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll take the next question.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Bhavna Singh, working with CRF. We have already seen that over last several decades, China has practiced a policy of patriotic education, where they have basically been giving bilingual education to minorities, which means that basically they also provided Chinese education and also provided ethnic education. But with this law, they are basically moving towards a direction where there will be lesser and lesser preservation of the ethnic education. So in that sense, has there been a kind of a reaction from the people within Tibet, where they have at least demonstrated non-violent protests against this law? Or what has been the immediate reaction from other Tibetans around the world on this particular move that the Chinese government has taken? And are we actually looking towards a scenario where, the ethnic education that the Tibetans provide, they have basically managed to kind of preserve that culture outside China, but not inside China? Thank you.
Patriotic re-education has been going on since the 90s. So I think some of our panelists talked about what China has been doing. The first phase, immediately after invasion, what happened, and since 1959 till Panchen Lama wrote this 70,000 character letter to the Chinese leadership. And then there's 10 long years of cultural revolution, then little freedom in the 80s during Hu Yaobang and, some other leaders in the Chinese, of course, led by Deng Xiaoping during those days. Then there was also the modernization, development of the Western region and all that. And then there was, from 2000 onwards, we talked about sedentarization of nomads, ghettos, make it easier for China to control. And this is the final nail on the Tibetans. So in this law, the whole administration, starting from the top leadership to the public, has to be involved in implementation. So anybody who goes against that goes against the law. So it involves not just the public, the Tibetan public or the other public, but authorities at every level. Now we see that they are forming more and more committees to look into how to implement the new so-called ethnic unity law. So this will have a very, very castigating effect, with the whole ideas. I think Professor Jayadeva ji also mentioned erasure of Tibetan identity. So that is the whole idea. And I remember about 10, 12 years ago, I was told by a Chinese scholar that Chinese government says that if Tibetans have to be disconnected with Tibetan language, then we have to translate all Buddhist texts and medical texts, Tibetan medicine texts into Chinese. Then there's no need for Tibetans to study Tibetan, because these are two areas where Tibetans use Tibetan the most. So those efforts have been there, from the time they invaded Tibet to now. It has been going on, and this is going to be very detrimental, because this is over all-encompassing. It affects every part of our. Now, there is no space. There is no space to do anything right now. The surveillance methods Professor Kondapalli talked about, you can't even make a move. There have been 157 self-immolations from 2009 to 2022, most of them between 17 to 35 years old, who have never witnessed independent Tibet or 10 long years of cultural revolution. But the surveillance is so much, iris scanning, your mobile, everything. You're just reduced to a barcode now in the whole of China. So there's nothing much you can do, but if you go on TikTok and others, people are expressing themselves, even at the risk of being imprisoned or losing their life. Now, younger generations are also speaking more in Tibetan to explain about, even religious institutions, just visiting and taking a tour of religious, expressing only in Tibetan. So that has been there. Even the White Wednesday days that we followed, it has been there for the last 6-7 years, because China was imposing too much of their will on the Tibetan people, that the Tibetans will have to show their displeasure, and then again, ingenuity of the Tibetans inside Tibet. We looked at so many different ways of non-violent methods written by some of our friends like Jean Sharp and others. But you can add more from Tibetan experience of non-violent methods, or how Tibetans have been adapting to all these controls and still expressing themselves. So we hear more and more voices from Tibet, from the elderly, particularly teachers who have been involved in teaching Tibetan language for a long time, and the younger generations of Tibetans who are expressing their disillusionment with what China is doing. So I think that is a positive sign, but still it's not enough. So if the control is too much, then it will have very, very severe consequences on the identity of the younger generations of Tibetans. So outside, of course, we try as much as we can, but it's very difficult to influence programs inside Tibet. Since 2018, outsiders cannot work inside Tibet. No non-governmental organizations are allowed to function inside Tibet. So everything is government now, and excluding all influence from outside. This is what is happening. We are still trying to learn as much as possible, because they are still allowing some people to come in, and but there is a lot more restriction than earlier. Earlier you could visit Tibet, you can visit some other parts of Tibet, get permission, but now they say, okay, you came to meet with your family, you stay here for 1 month or 3 months, or whatever, however long you stay, they don't give you access to other areas. So that also restricts our information flow, but then of course we try our best in getting as much information as possible. We have to develop our own information management system, and also develop communication strategy in times to come. And we are already working as much as possible within our capacity to reach out to the global community as possible.
or between the Dalai Lama's representatives and the Chinese government?
I have mentioned about the back channels some 2-3 years ago when I spoke to BBC on Hard Talk, and since that time I've been asked this question many times. I keep saying, of course, the Chinese government wants us to say that there's nothing going on. They don't want us to acknowledge anything, but I cannot lie. So I do admit to back channels, but it is nothing consequential right now. It's nothing to do with even re-establishing contact. Forget about negotiations or, so the back channels are happening, it's there, but it's merely to convey messages. Nothing more than that. But when the real contact is re-established, if there is a real negotiation, then His Holiness will appoint envoys or special envoys to deal with the Chinese. Till such a time, I'll be responsible for carrying forward whatever is there, but nothing consequential.
Excellency, my name is Ajay Banerjee. I'm a journalist. I intend to ask you a small little question. You mentioned how you're working with other governments with regards to this new ethnic law. What is the tie-up or what is the message you have for the Indian government? Have you taken up with them? What should India be doing in this case to help you or propagate your opinion on the new ethnic law?
With the Indian government, I have always said I'm in no position to advise the Indian government. There are a lot of smart people in the government of India to do their job. So, but I always maintained that we have a very transparent relationship with the government of India. There are too many things on the table between the government of India and China right now. Of course, we would like India to be much more vocal, more visible about their positions. But then, as I always said, every country has their national interests, whether it's India or the United States or any country in this world. So we also have to be concerned about the national interests of the countries that we work with, particularly the government of India. So, of course, it's very evident that we exist here only because of the government of India. So if it is not for the government and people of India, we don't exist. It's as simple as that. So, of course, I don't have to be very explicit about the conversations that we have with government of India, but rest assured, I feel very positive, and I've always mentioned that I don't think India will never be on the wrong side of history. India will always be on the right side of history.
Yeah. I have the same question. Okay, it's the same question. All right, here.
Thank you, and this was very wonderful morning. So I have a question to Dr. Desal and Honorable Sikyong Tsering may also answer this. See, you said that there has been a remarkable coherence in the Tibetan movement around the person of His Holiness Dalai Lama. So my question is that in the post-Dalai Lama, 14th Dalai Lama scenario, it is almost certain that there will be two Dalai Lamas. One, of course, by Dharamshala, and one, of course, will be discovered by Chinese authorities. So, do you anticipate a split, divide, schism in Tibetan spiritual universe by this situation in long term? And what measures you will take to ensure that the Tibetan this spiritual universe remains undivided?
You're talking about split within the Tibetan community.
Community, yeah, religious divide, the divide in the community.
Now, one of our job right now, of course, we cannot predict the future. We cannot discount anything. We cannot even affirm anything, because that will be in the future. We don't have clairvoyance to decide what the future is going to be. But what we are trying to do is, when you talk about His Holiness reincarnation, the first community that gets impacted is the Tibetan community, whether it's inside Tibet or outside Tibet. So inside Tibet, there's nothing much we can do, considering the situation that we already talked about. So outside Tibet, I think we can say that we have all the Tibetan community in unison on this position, because it's not just the ordinary people who wrote to His Holiness about his reincarnation, a continuation of the Kondapalli institution. But if you notice, last July, just before His Holiness' birthday, 90th birthday, on July 2nd, we had a congregation of all the Buddhist leaders from all traditions in Dharamsala. For the international community, maybe that's not so important, but for the Tibetan community, it's very, very important that we have consensus of all the traditions regarding what His Holiness has said. So the council, the religious council that was held in Dharamsala were in one voice when it comes to what His Holiness had said, and everybody agreed to what His Holiness had already mentioned about the continuation of the Kondapalli Trust of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the responsibility of selecting the next Dalai Lama lying with the Kondapalli Trust of that I particularly stress to different administrations, because one thing China does not have is the Kondapalli Trust of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So China can always say, you're talking about scenario of two Dalai Lamas, which looks most likely if you look at what China is trying to do and what we will be doing on our own also. So from our perspective, what we need to do is the CTA, because there have been also a lot of voices in support for CTA. There have been a lot of, I think, inputs to the government of India to make sure that CTA remains, is sustained over the period. From our side also, we have to do everything possible to make sure that this institution, this democratic institution in exile, unlike any other exile community, no other community have that, a fully functional democratic polity. So what we are trying to do at this point of time is to institutionalize our relations, because whatever respect, little respect and dignity we get today is because of His Holiness the Dalai Lama standing globally and the respect that he commands from people. So when His Holiness is alive, we have to make sure to institutionalize our relations with governments, whether it's government of India or any government that we deal with. And this will also become a precedent and a protocol for future Sikyongs. Another 20, 30 years down the line, when His Holiness is no longer with us, then we should be able to carry our responsibilities during the interregnum between this Dalai Lama and the next Dalai Lama. So that is how we are planning to move. Of course, Chinese will keep doing their own thing, so that's why I keep sending messages to Chinese, do you want a lifelong headache or not? So Xi Jinping will create this problem, but he won't be there to resolve it. We don't know how long he's going to live. And of course they know that if they can control the next Dalai Lama, then they can control Tibet. We also can sense that Chinese government will use the Chinese pension, because now they have been sending him more and more into Tibet to show to the world that Tibetans inside Tibet have respect for the Chinese pension, or there is some kind of legitimacy for the Chinese pension. But Tibetans inside Tibet are confused. As communist members, they are not allowed to visit monasteries. But when Chinese pension gives teachings like the Kala Chakra, which they did last year, then they are forced to go and listen. Even the communist cadres are forced to listen to the Chinese pension. So you see all this paradox in how China does. They always have two sides of anything that they do. So whatever comes of use to them, they use it. For them, a law is a law if it is of use to them. A law is not a law if it is not used to them. You must have heard the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson saying, you cannot use the law to shield your misdeeds. So you cannot even quote Chinese law to protect yourself. So law is meant for only those who want, for the leadership, if they think it's useful for them. It's not meant for the public. And law is only, that's why we keep saying Chinese always have this elephant's tusk to show and a teeth to eat. Always two different things. Just watch, don't just take China at face value. Watch what they're saying and look at what they're doing. It's always two different things. That is what the world needs to understand if we have to deal with China. Now, within the Tibetan community, We are trying our best to do whatever we can to follow the established traditions for the selection of the next Dalai Lama. And His Holiness has made it very clear that it will be the Gandhem Podang Trust of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, who will be responsible for this. And I tell the Americans, I tell our other countries also to stress on this, because China does not have that. Because otherwise they will say, oh, the Chinese Panchen himself initiated the selection committee, they followed their tradition, we didn't interfere, and the only thing we did was to put the final seal. They will definitely do that. And that's what we are seeing, the trend we are seeing is towards that end. So we have to make sure that these are not legitimized. And I hope the international community also will not repeat the statement like Tibet is part of China's since ancient times, whatever, or Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. I hope the international community will not say that Chinese Dalai Lama is the real Dalai Lama. So then they will have to do a lot of introspection as to where they stand in terms of religious freedom, in terms of all other freedoms of expression. You want to add something to, I think Bakshi also mentioned that he would like to hear your
please, if there are any comments, we are happy to hear or concluding remarks from any of you, if there is any. All right. Thank you very much. We are perfectly on time. And with this, we come to the conclusion of this very important panel discussion organized by Tibet Policy Institute, rightly titled, China's New Ethnic Law, a Legal Assault on the Survival of Tibetan Language, Culture, and Identity. I would like to thank our Honorable Sikyong, the elected political leader of Tibet people, and the President of Central Tibet Administration, for accepting to be here despite a very, very busy schedule. Thank you very much, sir. Then we also like to thank our panelists, Major General J.D. Bakshi ji, Jayadeva Ranade ji, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli ji, for accepting our invitation to be here. And I would also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Desal, and all of you, all the panelists, for this very powerful speech that you gave here at this panel discussion. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you for coming despite being holiday today. And it's nice to see that so many of you have come here, many journalists, a few diplomats, and then also researchers from different think tanks and scholars. Thank you very much for being here. This shows that this is a serious issue, and we request the global community and the media to write about it, write about intent behind this law that China is going to implement across the territory that it has occupied. Because there's, as all the panelists have highlighted, this is nothing more than a genocide in the making, and the global community cannot shut their eyes and put a hand on over their ears. So we have to do something collectively, and we Tibetans are bravely challenging this. And in Tibet, there's enormous emotional resistance, open resistance against this new law, and that is visible out there. And we, as our Honorable Sikyong said, we are also doing whatever we can. And we know that we will prevail. And for that, we need global community support. And we expect all of you to write. Thank you very much. We have, because it's very hot today, we have served juice out there. So please have juice there. Thank you very much. Thank you.